Well, welcome everyone. It's great to see so many of you here today. We are now just past President Trump 47's first 100 days, his first 100 days for the second time. And our viewers all know the 100-day mark was set by FDR in his time. It was a benchmark for passing legislation and taking a number of executive actions and seizing the reins of policy action in a moment of national crisis. So today we'll try to discuss President Trump's first 100 days in the framework of presidential powers and the Constitution, a topic which has been a major area of focus and actually an undertaking here at the Miller Center over much of the last decade. As you all watching have probably noticed, President Trump has been issuing a record-breaking number of executive actions and executive orders on a range of matters, from cutting government programs to undoing DEI programs in government and for organizations that receive federal funds, as well as raising tariffs, and the list goes on and on. In fact, we'll put up on a slide here. That's President Trump compared to the last 4 presidents, and each president has exceeded the last. If you tracked FDR on there, it would be just slightly north of Joe Biden, but well south of Donald Trump. While he has had some initial steady polls, including a higher polling rating at his inauguration than as 47 than he had at 45, in recent weeks, those efforts have started to take their toll. Polls out in the last week show that as President Trump's popularity is at an all-time low for newly elected presidents at the 100-day mark. And you can see that there with him at 39 and other presidents hovering around 50%. The biggest thing weighing his popularity are his actions on the economy. Thank you. 50% of those responding said that the president has made the economy worse. Only 21% say that he has made it better. About 42% approve of his actions on the economy, while 55% disapprove. And if we can keep that slide up, what you see on the left, particularly those in the room where the print's a little small, on the left you see approval or disapproval of different policy areas. And on the right you see assessments of whether or not the president should or should not be able to do a series of things. So on the left side, his numbers are far better on immigration. 47% approve and 51% disapprove of his actions on immigration. They're much worse on foreign policy, down toward the bottom, second from the bottom. 35% approve of the president's actions in the war between Russia and Ukraine, and 56% disapprove. But going to presidential powers, the focus of our conversation today here on his 100-day mark, only 28% agree that the president should be able to impose tariffs without any authorization from Congress. 61% disagree. Even fewer support the president's ability to eliminate government programs enacted by Congress, with 21% agreeing here and only 54% disagreeing. A whopping 76% of Americans don't think the president can ignore Supreme Court rulings, where 6% believe he can. Indeed, concern against presidential overreach is long-standing. Consistently across presidencies, about 3 out of 4 Americans think presidents don't need more power. One of the challenges in our political system is when a Democrat's in office, Republicans poll higher on don't thinking the president should use those power, and when a Republican's in office, Democrats have a higher assessment. So to discuss these trends, we have a really all-star panel today. Some of the best scholars and highest practitioners in the country. We're going to start with Sid Milkis. Sid has been perhaps the leading student of this trend of rising presidential power. His new book with Nick Jacobs is titled Subverting the Republic, Donald Trump and the Perils of Presidentialism. The book jacket, which was completed after the 2024 election but before President Trump's inauguration, reads, "His unprecedented rise to power brazenly defies established constitutional norms and institutions, and Trump 2.0 promises another disruptive term." Joining Sid and me on our all-star panel are Sai Prakash, a Miller Center faculty fellow and UVA professor of law. Cy clerked on the Supreme Court for Justice Clarence Thomas, and also has authored 2 books about the executive: Imperial from the Beginning, the Constitution of the Original Executive, and The Living Presidency, an originalist argument against its ever-expanding power. Going alphabetically, to my right, just seated here, maybe politically, is Chief of Staff to Vice President Mike Pence. Before that, Chief Legislative Affairs of the first Trump presidency. I carry with me a card Mark gave me in 2018 that lists the unprecedented legislative achievements of the first Trump presidency, and also a former Miller Center practitioner, senior fellow. Mark, it's great to have you back with us. And to my left, not necessarily politically, but maybe also, but here at the table, Louisa Terrell, who is Chief of Legislative Affairs for President Biden, and before that in the Biden-Obama administration, and the newest Miller Center practitioner, senior fellow. It's really great to have you back with us, and great to have you on the team. So the first question, and we'll start with Sid, since you wrote the book. You trace this growing use of presidential powers across presidencies. In fact, you argue Trump is a symptom, not the disease itself. Reforming the presidency, therefore, requires more than treating a symptom. It necessitates a comprehensive examination and restructuring of institutional incentives and powers that have long been vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. The book argues that Democrats and Republicans depend on presidential candidates and presidents to pronounce party direction, to raise funds, to campaign on behalf of their partisan brethren, to mobilize the grassroots, and to advance party programs through administration action, as well as court appointments. So, Sid, is Trump a symptom and a cause? How would we know, and what has the last 100 days told us about this?
That sounds like a question I would have gotten on my PhD oral exams.
Here's your oral exam.
Thank you so much for having this. It's an honor to be here with Mark, Cy, and Louisa, all of whom know a lot more about politics than I do. Notice he didn't say where I fit politically, guys, when he did his introduction. So I do think Trump is a symptom, which is not to deny his importance and the fact that he's brought things to a culmination. But I think President Trump, when he emerged in 2015, tapped into developments that had been underway for several decades. And I think he's the consequence, or the age of Trump is the consequence of the confluence of 2 major events. One, the expansion of executive power, and the other, the development of red and blue America, the fracturing of the country, where partisan polarization becomes really at the core of our political system. The first, the expansion of executive power, so I can trace this back to the Constitution, to the very beginning, and I do hear echoes of Patrick Henry, the anti-federalist, when I study the contemporary presidency. But I really think the New Deal and Roosevelt was an inflection point. Because there we move from what Herbert Hoover called trying to think of exactly how he put it in the 18th. I can't remember. So, called for I can't remember. He called for a spirit individualism. And with Roosevelt and the New Deal, there's the federal government becomes involved in national and economic security. And as the 1936 Democratic Platform says, the new self-evident truth of American politics is security. And that expansion of the national government power plays to the benefit of the national office of the president. And there's also a change in the party system. Up to the New Deal, we still have a pretty resilient party system, which is decentralized and independent of the presidency. In fact, in national conventions, provides peer review for the selection of presidential candidates. With the development of the New Deal, that party system grows weaker, and we have the development of a more national programmatic party. And whereas the traditional decentralized party restrained president, the national programmatic party empowers them. The other thing, polarization really begins to take effect with the cosmic crack-up of the 1960s. When I talk about the 60s with my students, it's like I'm talking about ancient history. But I lived through it, and I've studied it, and it's really an important moment in American politics.
If I was born in the 60s, does that make me ancient?
Yeah, not as ancient as I am. Yeah, pretty ancient. So what happens in the 60s, we get these culture wars, and we begin to fight over these polarizing issues like patriotism, civil rights.
And the president is central to that.
And the president is central to that. Sexual identity, all these issues that are pretty, race, all these issues that are very polarizing, which ask the fundamental question, who is an American, really become paramount because of the cultural changes of the 1960s. Now, the question of who belongs, who's an American, pervades all of American history. But what's different about the post-60 years is it becomes a routine part of American politics. And that fractures the country into red and blue America. And the presidency gets pulled into this vortex of partisan polarization. Because partisan gridlock, which develops as a result of these cultural issues reverberating through to our own political time, makes it very difficult for the political system to operate through normal constitutional channels. So the parties begin to look at the president kind of like Alexander the Great, who can cut the Gordian knot, break through partisan gridlock, and advance the party's causes.
And so does the question, who is an American, identified so closely with the president, does that explain why President Trump is focused so much on both immigration and trade? In your view?
Yeah, and I think
in his first 100 days.
And I think one of the reasons it's not just the presidents are usurping power in the face of this conflict, but both parties come to be dominated by their bases, by activists and donors who reject the kind of pragmatic party politics of the traditional party system, and really engage in a less compromising form of politics. And the party forms like McGovern-Fraser really advance that, weakening the party organizations, making room for the power of these activists. So a lot of times, presidents like Joe Biden, I think, really had his career most of his career in the legislature. Louisa could talk about this better than I. And he was reluctant to play this role as the vanguard of democratic causes. But the pressures from the social activists eventually pushed him to engage in pretty aggressive administrative action. And we saw that with things like his effort to issue an executive order for debt relief, for student debt relief.
So Mark, you were there for not just the first 100 days, the first year and a half of Trump 45. You've watched the first 100 days here. How much is he driven by the base? How much is he appealing to the base? How does this differ from the last one?
Well, Bill, thanks for having me. It's great to be back. Not only as I did serve all 4 years, except for my 6-month stint here at the Miller Center. But I earned my MBA at Darden, and it's always great to get out of D.C. and be here in Charlottesville. And my oldest son just graduated here, undergraduate, last year. So thanks for having me back.
He was a classmate of my daughter's.
Yes. Look, I think that for President Trump, I recall back in 2016 on the campaign trail, one of the rally lines that he would use was to condemn the Obama presidency as the imperial presidency that decided they could just do actions by executive order. And the irony of that, of course, was at the time, President Obama, I think, had grown really frustrated about not being able to pass immigration reform in Congress. And it even stated that he did not have the authority to wave a magic wand. And yet that's exactly what he tried to do when he passed the executive order trying to legalize DACA. And so that was like part of the president's appeal as he campaigned in 2016. I don't know if you still have that chart, if you could pull up the chart you started with to show the number of executive actions by each president.
You go back to chart 1.
But I think what you'll see is that in the early months of the first administration, there actually were pretty few. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important, it's hard for us, but I think it's important to try to delineate that I think President Trump grew to enjoy them as press events. And so in many cases, there are executive actions that he announces that really don't have teeth legally. But he announces them to drive a message and to try to push a narrative that he wants the American people to follow. At the same time, I think in the second administration, you've seen that on steroids. And I think that part of that is, as Sid said, in a polarized country, there's a frustration of not being able to pass things legislatively. And so that drives part of it. And I think that a lot of those actions are both on the immigration and trade fronts, which I think are his two issues he's trying to push forward the most. But I also think that President Trump is somebody who, as we all know, is always going to test boundaries. And I think the way he views it is, I'm going to push this until the judiciary branch stops me. And I think eventually the judicial branch will. And I think that our founders created a very enduring system, and it has pendulum swings. And I think there's no doubt that right now we're in a swing that has greater executive authority. But I think eventually the amazing system that was created will provide a swing back. But I think that as Sid said, this is not just a Trump phenomenon. It's one that's been growing on both sides. And I think President Trump has taken on steroids. But again, as you see there in the beginning of Trump 2017, the first, quarter of the administration was really not that significant. And then you can see the rise toward the end. And I think that's where he really began to appreciate, I can use these as vehicles to have a press conference inside the Oval Office. And so in many cases, they were less legally enforcing. In many cases, they were message driving. I do think that has shifted, and they're both now in reality. And he feels like, I'm going to assert that it's legal, and until the judicial branch stops me, that's what we're going to do.
So, Louise, it may be a good time to turn to you. In fact, as I'm looking at President Biden's, it looks like at first he did a lot. I'm guessing that's overturning a bunch of the ones that President Trump had done, right? And that's become the ping pong pattern here, right? You come in, your predecessor has just done a bunch of stuff. You undo that. And then it goes flat. And I'm guessing during that flat part, you're trying to do a bunch of deals on the Hill.
Yes. I do think that's right. So that creep up that you see at the very beginning, I agree with you completely. And I should have prefaced this. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I share Mark's glee in being out of Washington, D.C. So thank you. So I agree with you, Bill. I think we're going to see that as an enduring trend, right? That you're going to come into office, your supporters are asking you to come in and do as much undoing as you possibly can. And so that doesn't change. I think you are correct also when we came into the White House. I think because of President Biden's long history in Congress, he was ready to kind of really focus as much as he possibly could in those first 2 years around what we could accomplish legislatively. And we were coming in with, there was a strong group behind us, right? There was so much of that election was about a change election and coming in and kind of recalibrating. So there's a lot of momentum behind us from, as Sid said, whether it's groups or other kinds of advocates that are coming in. But I agree. I want to say two things about that Mark said that part of what I think, and I don't want to speak for our current president, but I think he does have a very innate understanding of the electorate. And this idea of kind of impatience, doing both messaging and communicating the way you do with an executive order, understanding that most Americans are kind of frustrated with Washington, D.C., their trust in those institutions is low. There's a way that I think the president right now is sort of speaking to that in some ways through these executive actions around kind of really understanding kind of the impatience, the attention, quickness that one needs to be acclimated in as a politician that's very different now. So I think that's part of what he is capturing and doing quite well, if you're looking at it by that barometer.
Maybe you could both give us a little insight, because I want to turn aside not just on the courts, but on the constitutional theory that drives the belief that executives can do a lot. But before going there, I'd just love to hear you both say, what's going on the Hill behind the scenes right now? The president has a big agenda legislatively, but right now we've seen frameworks of action, but not real action. So and we'll talk about confirmations in a bit, but in terms of legislating and actually passing laws, FDR was known for passing a lot of stuff in 100 days. So far, no big bills. You guys got some stuff done. You guys
I know, I've got to bring a card next time, I promise.
Maybe
I might,
cards, maybe
yeah,
cards,
no.
right?
To be fair, I brought a card because I think there was a perception that even Bill was pushing of how little the Trump administration accomplished. And so I was trying to refute that.
Excellent.
And
I
I've
really-
carried it around for 8 years
Yeah.
now. 7 years.
Yeah. Look, I'll try to go first. I think I think one of the biggest differences between Trump 2.0 and Trump 1.0 is when he was elected in 2016 and took power in 2017, the Republican Party was still very divided. And if you look at legislative attempts that we had to repeal Obamacare first and failed before passing tax legislation, there was a lot of Republican opposition. There was Republican opposition from Collins, Murkowski, McCain, Flake, Corker, and that was really hard to corral. Today, he controls the Republican Party entirely. And I think you've seen that with the confirming of people that I think in normal circumstances would not pass muster. They would not get confirmed into a cabinet. And I think that there's also now a reluctance for members to speak out because I think President Trump has shown a willingness to engage in primaries in ways that other presidents haven't, that I think has created an enormous amount of fear among congressional Republicans. We can debate whether that's merited fear and that some of their terms will long outlast President Trump's, but I think that's the reality of what we face today because in my personal conversations with members, there's a lot of concern about some of the policies, but there's an absolute reluctance for them to actually speak out in any way. And I think one of the ways that I think we've seen dramatically the acquiescence of legislative authority to the executive branch is on trade. And I don't think our founders intended for the ability to tax to be one that the executive branch could unilaterally determine. And so I think that's been one of the most dramatic changes. And I think that in the first administration, President Trump was still trying to unify the party behind him and knew he didn't have that yet. Today, he exerts that influence in a far more dramatic way in which many of the members of Republicans on the Hill are simply cowed by it. And so there is not the same sort of pushback or need he feels to work with legislature. He tells them what he instructs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really agree. This sounds kind of minor and like push back if you don't agree. I do think there's something right now, I always think about math, right? Because when you're trying to get things done, you're constantly kind of whipping your votes. And I think the math is kind of interesting and is giving the president an even stronger hand, right? He has such a slim majority in the House. Speaker Johnson needed the president specifically to be speaker, right? So it's oftentimes presidents from the beginning of time as sort of strong-armed members of Congress all the time to try and get their agenda done. But here, because it is such a small margin, the math piece of this, I think, also kind of really tightens the hold and the ways in which Speaker Johnson, specifically both personally and politically, needs him. I think that plays it all of a part that I think Mark accurately describes. And I would just say, on the money front, like that is days of conversation about how we fix all the problems of the money pieces that you raised. But I do think part of also what's unique here is the ability to command or seemingly command an extraordinary amount of money really quickly in a primary. Right, so it's also to be able to say whether, and Musk was able to execute some of that, not to positive effect in the Wisconsin race, but I think it's like demonstrative of, again, part of the reinforcing the fear piece of standing in line. And frankly, I think you see a little glimmer in the Senate, which is different. Their math is different, got a little bit of room there. You've seen someone like Lisa Murkowski articulate her own fear, the fear that is felt. And again, whether it's real, perceived, debate about that, but that's her perception of it. And interestingly enough, Leader Thune is elected in a blind election, right? No one knows where anyone voted on that. That to me is instructive. But I will say, as someone who has a deep love and affection and respect for Congress, I think there's a lot of them who are sitting back and like going to lunch and hoping that the courts do their job. And whether the Senate articulated the resistance to recess appointments at the beginning, and since that point, I haven't seen a lot of outward, I think lots of quiet conversations, but again, I really think that they're really relying on the courts here to do that and query what the courts should do if they see a Congress not fighting back. Like, I think that's an interesting, does the court need to see that at all? Does that bear into any of their kind of decision making?
A sign that Luis is going to be a great senior fellow here, is that she's steering the conversation exactly to where it's supposed to go.
Right.
So, Sai, tell us about this unitary theory of the executive, right? There is a very prominent theory that has become part of the White House's signing statements, part of its approach to, part of its executive orders is claiming that the president actually has the power to go beyond Congress, in a sense, in a range of different things. Where does this come from, and how do you see it playing out right now?
Well, the theory, I think comes from the Reagan administration, and the claim is that the president is in charge of the executive branch, right? There's an adjective and a noun, and the president's supposed to be in charge of the executive branch in the same way that, Congress would be in charge of the GAO and other things that are under Congress. And the problem with the theory, at least given the 1980s and even today, was that there were all these independent agencies composed of multi-member commissions where the agencies were supposed to be doing things independent of the president, including executing the law. And the Reagan folks opposed that, and they took some measures in that direction. And there were people, famous people who were in the Reagan administration, John Roberts and Sam Alito and other folks who had this view, and they continue to have this view on the court. And one of the principal features of the claim is the president gets to direct the executive branch, tell them what to do, because it's his branch. He also gets to remove people, notwithstanding Congress's attempt to give them tenure protections. And so it's become a theory, even though it started out as a theory about the president gets to control a particular branch, it's become a theory of just the president gets to do what he wants. I don't think that that's what the theory was originally about. There is no claim that the president gets to make laws or ignore laws. Some laws are unconstitutional, and the courts, have said that in the past, and have said that, Congress can't limit the pardon power, for instance. They said that after the Civil War. During the Obama administration, they said that Congress couldn't force the president to, recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. So there's long been the sense that, Congress isn't all powerful, nor is the president. I think there are other things going on beside the unitary executive that explain what's going on in the executive branch. One of them is the idea that Congress has delegated vast amounts of power to the executive in its statutes, and that the president is seizing that authority to do things. And then even when Congress hasn't delegated the authority, there are aggressive readings of statutes that the executive branch is propounding in order to advance its agenda, right? So the president is using IEPA to impose tariffs. It's not obvious that statute gives him that authority. I think it doesn't. But
IEPA is International Emergency Powers Act.
Executive.
Economics in there someplace.
Yes,
It's one of those.
there's a
Emergency Economic Powers Act.
Thank you.
There's a lot of letters there. It's but I think they have the attitude that maybe it was Sid said that, like, I'm going to do stuff, and if maybe Mark said this, I'm going to do stuff, and we'll find out whether I have the legal authority to do it after the fact. And it's again not just President Trump; it's true for the last several presidents. If they have a belief that's deep in their heart, and they believe it's going to help their party, or both, they're just going to do stuff and see what happens. And that's what he's doing. And I actually think the court will likely strike that down. But it's this, it's these broad delegations, it's this willingness to push the line in a way that, 50 or 100 years ago they would be less willing to do, and do so less frequently. That I think gets us to this point, because it's not, the unitary executive theory is a theory about executive authority, not about delegations or how aggressively to read statutes to advance your agenda.
Said you've followed this in previous administrations, Democratic and Republican ones. Why do presidents say they do it? Do they say they do it because the base tells them to do it? Do they say they do it because they really just want to get stuff done? Do they feel that there are emergencies out there, or is it some combination of all of those things?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I just want to say my coffee finally kicked in. It was a little slow this morning. So Hoover in 1928, his platform was rugged individualism.
Rugged individuals, yeah.
I knew it had something to do with individualism. It's unclear with all this executive power whether that's still important in American politics. One thing I wanted to say about the unitary executive, one thing that seems to distinguish the recent renditions of that are there's an argument, particularly from the Republican Party, that Congress and the courts don't have oversight over what the president does with the executive branch. We saw that with torture during the George W. Bush administration. We see that with immigration in the Trump administration. I think it really starts with Roosevelt, and the president becomes an institution with Roosevelt. Roosevelt gets through Congress after a 2-year battle, the Executive Reorganization Act of 1939, and that sets up the White House office, the West Wing, and the executive office of the president. And much of the policy and political power has now been centralized in this presidential institution. So what before was an office is now an institution empowered to do things with the stroke of the pen. And beyond the institutional power is justified by the view. And this really is nothing completely new with the New Deal, but it really becomes more philosophically acceptable with the New Deal, that only the president represents the whole country. Only the president, as Jefferson put it, only the president sees the whole ground. So I've checked off, we have to always mention Jefferson at least once. We checked off that box, guy. But that became kind of a more institutionalized after the New Deal. And so Congress represents particular interest. The president really represents the nation.
So to Mark and Louisa, so when the president does these things by executive action, claiming the authority, unitary or even more deeply stated, if members of Congress aren't publicly complaining, are they privately calling you saying, why are they doing this by executive action? Why aren't they trying to move it? Or is it obvious that things aren't going to move? And
My sense is that for most of them, it's obvious. It's more of a sense of political fear and political concern about their own re-election. And I think people say, well, when does this begin to change? In my mind, it begins to change after primary season. Like after people have gotten through primaries about a year from now, I think you'll begin to see a little bit more independence. But to go back to the points on this unitary executive, I do think it's important that it's not entirely black and white. That many of us could subscribe to that theory and believe that over the last several decades that there's been a lot of commissions that have been created that don't have clarity about their supervision. And I do think it's fair to say the executive branch should exert that authority. There's a difference between that and, again, where I go to is the trade agenda, where I think it's very clear our founders decided the ability to tax belonged to the legislative branch. And this is a clear violation. So you can believe that actually there is a lot of basis that the executive should have the authority and the Congress has oversight, but they can make decisions on hiring and firing. And I think there's a lot of support, I think, in many cases among conservatives for what's happening with DOGE and believing we're $36 trillion in debt. And it's okay for the executive branch to have this authority. Congress has oversight. But there's some clear delineations, I think, constitutionally, that on trade, that is not one the executive branch can unilaterally decide what he's going to tax the American people. That belongs to Congress.
you're really good at this too, Mark. Can you put slide 4 up here, please, on tariffs? So this is the declaration of a national emergency in past administrations. The red ones are Republican presidents. The blue ones are Democratic presidents declaring national emergencies. And we're now seeing Trump 47, and the biggest declaration has been on the tariff front. And how's that going down on the Hill, including on the Republican side?
Well, again, I think that they're members of Congress who know it's their authority, but they don't want to challenge the
But
current
we have had a
branch.
few Republicans stand up on trade.
Come on. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous.
Oh, he's not even giving them like a tiny
No,
A for effort.
it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
No, there's not an A for effort.
effort.
There's nothing that they've done. There may be one press conference where somebody says, maybe I'm uncomfortable. Seriously, this is absurd of what actually is transpiring. And again, when you talk about IEPA, what the president asserted, and again, I think the president's saying, I'm going to do this so the court stop me. But, the reason he used it is to say for fentanyl, right? He needed an emergency to say this gives me the power to do this. Well, what is the messaging currently? It's the explanation for tariffs. I've heard it's fentanyl. I've heard it's because of our trade imbalance. I've heard it's because we need to lower trade barriers across the globe. I've heard it's actually not China. The U.S. Trade Representative was on TV last night saying, actually, this isn't about China. This is about resetting across the globe how we do trade deals. And so, you're basically using IEPA to say it's because of fentanyl, and I'm not saying that isn't a crisis, but there's no consistency whatsoever to justify what we're doing on the trade front. and there's really no pushback at all from Congress. I'm not going to give somebody because he says something, one point there. I think that, to be fair, I'd give Rand Paul credit for its introduction of the bill, and there were a couple Republicans who went along with that. But I mean, let's flip the tables and be honest. If this was a Democrat administration pushing this, there's no way Republicans would be giving this much authority to executive branch.
Agree. I think it's interesting. I was using this example when we were doing some preparation. If you and I, if Mark and I went up to the Hill right now and just started walking around in the hallways, and we asked, what is the basis for the emergency? You know how many people would tell us fentanyl? Like 4. Okay. So I think your point is really well taken here. Is that part of this is we have made kind of a joke, if you will, about when you exert this. And it is Congress's job, in fact, to be part of the answering this question, and they are not doing this. Now, I think this is all kind of to me, part of the question is tolerance. There is a court role in here, and what is the tolerance? When do they start poking their heads up? And I agree with Mark that the political gravity is really at when primary season is over, and they've sort of can take a sigh of relief and they get ready for what they have to do for their 26 midterm. I try and be a hopeful person, so maybe there are other signatures here that could make a difference, a kind of consumer price point that is bananas and really hurtful. I also think one of the sort of untold stories, or maybe Mark, you'll tell me if I'm just not reading the right things, is I think the impact on agriculture is going to be something that we are not talking about enough, have a good understanding. So my other question too is when we start to see that in a real way, does that have any impact that would speed up the clock? But those are political considerations that I just put out there. But I do think on my side of the aisle too, there needs to be they need to be articulating this question really carefully and making the case about it. And I do think that we own some of that. The Democrats, about sort of understanding what is the question, how do you put this into your political fight, what is this? And I don't think our side of the aisle is doing that in a way that is necessarily meeting the moment of all of some of the people who are working to get fine.
Switching back to the executive orders for just a second, broader beyond tariffs, but if I remember correctly, Elon Musk in running Doge said basically the emergency was the national debt, that this is the big, we're in a tunnel and there's a light at the end of the tunnel and it's the debt train coming at us. And that gave him the authority to slash federal spending. I remember reading in a Washington Post article, the kicker, the last line was, red states have universities too. Red states have federal government offices too. Are Republican members of Congress waiting for the Democratic barrage that's coming on these issues, quietly calling the White House saying, please slow this down?
Oh, I don't think so. I think that, to your point, I don't here to give advice to Democrats, but I think
we can do it to each other.
It's like the Democrats want to fight about federal money being taken away from Harvard that has a $53 billion endowment, or they want to fight about people who are wife beaters being taken out of our country. And I don't think they're focused on the economy in ways that they probably should be. I do think that the trade agenda has become a bigger and bigger challenge for the president in the short term. But on Doge, look, I think that we are $36 billion in debt. And none of our elected officials are being honest with the American people about this. I celebrate Doge cuts. I think our federal government's gotten way too big. I think it's good we have cuts. But on the one hand, I also think by doing this by executive action, there's no reason a future Democrat administration, if we believe that this can be done by executive branch, next Democrat administration can say, you know what, I'm going to eliminate Customs and Border Patrol. If you've established that precedent, why couldn't you? And so I think that all of these cuts need to be legislated to actually make them enforceable. Because if you're just going to say an executive branch can do it on the one side, somebody else can do it on the flip. So I support it, but I think it has to be legislated. And I think we're not being honest when you look at the American people and say, for the first time in American history, if you add up Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, it is more than 100% of our spending. The discretionary spending that we're fighting over is a tiny fraction of what our debt is. And so while I applaud it and I'm glad for it, it is immaterial to the future direction of our country fiscally, and neither party is being honest with the American people about it.
So going a little, it's a great point. I'm going to go a little off script here to have all four of you talk about the way the government budgets, right? We're 100 days in. We have framework after framework, but it's not clear if we're actually moving toward a budget agreement, new budget agreement with tax and spending. So what keeps happening is the last budget just keeps getting renewed in a continuing resolution. You both negotiated both big budget agreements and continuing resolutions. Is this the way it was intended to work? And how does the rest of our political system weigh in?
I think we can agree this was not the intent,
Right.
right? And I think, I also have a kid graduating from college, so I'm going to say we're generally of the same generation. I think that when we came up on the Hill, right, the appropriators were like who you wanted to be. When you were working for a new member of Congress, you were saying part of your, when you're planning your pathway to power, you'd be asking, like, do you want to be on a PROPS? Because those are the guys, and now gals, who are running the show. And that is not the case. So part of this is, I don't believe we're going backwards. I think we're always going forward. So query what that looks like. But this idea that we're going to go back to the good old days where like this was all happening within the appropriations committees and subcommittees, I'm not sure I'm ready to put that out there. But I do think that part of what Mark is talking about, much of which I agree with actually, part of that conversation should actually be happening if you were having like a legitimate appropriations conversation. And we truly have not had an appropriate appropriations conversation where you would be able to be talking about some of those things. And but I think there's a whole host of reasons of why that has occurred. But that would be my take on it, probably.
I think to your point, Congress has not passed its 13 appropriations bills in order since the 1990s. So basically what that leaves us doing is these things you hear about called continuing resolutions, which is just basically Congress punting their responsibility and we're passing existing bills. On the budget reconciliation, that is, I mean, it's a terminology, but it's a tool used by both sides that get below the 60-vote threshold in the Senate to pass your agenda. And that's what the administration is currently pursuing. I think it's to be a much bumpier road this summer than I think is conventional wisdom. I think a lot of people think Republicans have the House, the Senate, they'll pass tax relief. But I think there's more and more consequences from this trade agenda and more economic uncertainty. I think it's to be a much bumpier road ahead this year to get it passed.
I want to come back to the actual substance of the agreement, but I do want to go to the institutions because both of you in different books
Who are you pointing
have
to?
called for, I'm talking to Cy and Sid here, have both talked about the need for basically Congress to step up. Cy's terrific book on the Living Constitution really has a series of reforms for Congress to play a more forceful role. And Sid, you say we need to change the incentive. So what does this look like? What does a more active, engaged Article 1 Congress look like? Because Article 1 is taking the back seat. It may be Article 3 at this point in terms of the rank order.
Well, that might not be a bad thing, given the power.
I mean, Sid talks about, executive-centered parties. It's really an executive-centered government, right? The Congress can't legislate. It can't overturn what the president wants to do. Even if the House could somehow pass a bill, he would veto it. And so it's act first, and then you don't face any resistance from Congress because they don't have a supermajority to overcome what you want to do. And then you're only reliant upon the court. So, we kind of have almost a quasi-parliamentary system without a parliament because the president just does whatever, thus far he wants to do, with the courts being the only check. There's a bunch of reforms in that book. It was like 4 or 5 years ago. I'm not, I haven't seen anything change. If it's only gotten worse. I think the courts remain a vital check. I think they will check this presidency. They checked the previous one. There are certain things that this court wants to do, say with respect to the non-delegation doctrine, the major questions doctrine, that will result in less executive power. Ironically, there's some progressives on the court that don't want that to happen, but maybe they'll come to see the wisdom of it given what's transpiring now. I mean, there's easy things that Congress could do, and they could not direct it at the current president, right? I mean, even the emergency stuff we're talking about, we have emergency declarations that are 40 years old because there's no expiration on the authority that's given to the president once he declares an emergency. There's no reason to have 40-year-old emergencies. That should just be done by ordinary legislation. The way to solve that is to say that you can declare emergency, but your measures only last 60 days. And if you can't get us to agree that there's an emergency to pass legislation, well then, too bad for you and perhaps too bad for the country. But it's just delegation after delegation, lack of responsibility on the part of Congress, and obviously an inability to stop the behemoth once it begins moving. And I want to say, to respond to what Mark said, I believe in the unitary executive. I just think that it's not about legislating in the absence of Congress acting, right? And so I agree with, I think, almost entirely what Mark said. And I think the court has that view too. The court's going to, I think, uphold a lot of these removals and then strike down a lot of these executive decisions that rest on strained or wildly inappropriate readings of statute.
It's not an unlimited power, the unitary executive. He can't write the law. He has a power to execute it, but not to write it.
It's not the unitary legislative theory. It's the unitary executive theory. That's
Got
right.
it.
I think this, excuse me, my allergies are terrible today. I think this trend of presidents declaring crises is really, really dangerous. I think Madison's voice I always hear Madison's voice when I see presidents declare crises when there really aren't the objective facts for crises, where congressmen really can't give a reason for it. Madison said crises are the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. This is when we have states of exception, where presidents can exercise power and argue that there are no limit, that they are the law in these situations. When Roosevelt came in, he used the Trading with the Enemies Act to justify his closing of the banks, to declare a bank holiday. But that was a real emergency. The economy and the banking system and the stock market were forlorn. The economy was sinking drastically. And you could argue that some of the measures that Roosevelt took in his first 100 days, this is, of course, as you mentioned, this is where we get this standard. I think he issued 99 executive orders, but 16 laws were also passed, which delegated responsibility to the president. One of his aides said, somewhat histrionically, that capitalism was saved in 8 days. That probably is an exaggeration, but that was a real emergency. This is when we need the president to take strong action.
Our colleague Russell Riley had an op-ed in the Washington Post just earlier this week arguing similar to that. And the framing in some ways was the difference between these emergencies and that emergency is these aren't perceived as fully national emergencies. They're targeted special emergencies for key constituents who might feel an emergency, as opposed to seeing it more broadly. I may be slightly... Russell appears to be nodding back there that we've more or less captured his argument. I really highly recommend it. We're going to go to questions from the audience. And Cy mentioned the 60-day shot clock on emergencies. We're going to have a little shot clock at the end of this. It's not 60 days, it's 30 seconds. We've already handled a couple questions for the audience, and I'm just going to read them so that people know that. Why doesn't anyone mention the unsustainable U.S. debt that Trump inherited from, thank you, Mark, for your telepathic as well. Shouldn't getting our national financial future under control be priority one? So I do want to use this to come back to where you think that negotiations are going, including whether extending those tax cuts is going to reduce the deficit or contribute to it.
And what maybe that's just a math question, right?
It is a math question, yeah, in two senses.
Mm-hmm. Those are two separate questions. On the first, look, both Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, Donald Trump all campaigned they would not touch entitlements. Neither party is doing this honestly. Neither party is being candid with the American people. And that, yes, Donald Trump inherited an enormous debt, but also in his first term, we unfortunately added a lot to the debt. On the taxes.
There were a number of things going on there, including COVID added to the debt. And there was a theory behind the first tax cut that it might actually generate revenue. And I'm now making the case for the administration that it was going to generate revenue, but it didn't have a long enough lead time to kick in because the COVID disruption not just stopped the economic growth, but also fueled more.
I think actually it did, Bill. I think that I come at this from a different perspective, that I think that when we say we have to pay for things, I think we should pay for government programs. I think it's important to note, though, that the American people are the ones who own their money. It's not the government. So when we're giving relief on tax days, I don't feel like it's a pay for. I feel government programs should be paid for. I feel that if you go back to the tax relief in 2017, to your point, we lowered corporate tax rates from 35% to 21%. Our corporate tax rate in the United States was higher than communist China. It was an enormous disadvantage. By lowering the tax rate across the board, more taxpayers began paying into the system. The CBO projected $1.9 trillion deficit over the 10-year window. Halfway through, even with COVID, halfway through they came back and said, we underestimated revenue by $2.5 trillion. Tax revenue, halfway through the 10-year window, was $2.5 trillion more than they thought it would be, because there is a balance that sometimes if you do lower tax rates, you bring jobs back to America, you create more taxpayers. So I strongly support the continuation of the tax relief. I think the driver of our deficit is not that we are not taxing the American people enough. The driver is that we are spending way more than we should be. And the solution is actually cutting spending. That's where we need to go.
And entitlements would be...
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good luck with that.
I'm not saying, I've said, I condemn where we are with both our political leaders, but I believe that that's the conversation. And until actually the American people demand change because they see interest rates skyrocketing, we're not going to have the courage in Washington to do something about it. But you're asking where that solution is. I mean, we could keep going on this path and just keep taxing Americans more and more and not solving it.
Yeah. And just real quickly, the Affordable Care Act and Medicaid, which were considered entitlements and still aren't, like Social Security and Medicare, but they've become quasi-entitlements, very difficult to cut. So in this reconciliation bill, there'll be some stuff about Medicaid, but I checked the facts yesterday. 70 million Americans, most most impoverished and working class Americans, low wage Americans, are dependent on Medicaid. 40% of the births in the United States are paid for by Medicaid. And the Affordable Care Act strengthened Medicaid. The
Affordable Care Act helped put more people on Medicaid, Sid. The reality was when Obama passed, in 2016.
Medicaid expansion.
In 2016.
We could just go into a bar and fight this out.
There were 51 million people on Medicaid in America. Today it's 78. In the last 8 years, you've added 27 million people to Medicaid. It is not sustainable to keep doing that.
Yeah, I'm not arguing with that. I'm just saying it's going to be very difficult for the Republicans to reform Medicaid.
So, Louise, you said this is a math problem. There are at least two parts of the math. One is the math of the budget. The other is the math of Congress and getting 218 votes for something, anything.
Yeah.
How do you see this playing out?
Well, I'm going to agree with Mark that I think the summer is going to be bumpier. I think we're all going to hear, it's going to be done in May, it's going to be done in June. Like, we'll all talk to each other like maybe our Labor Day, right? Well, so I think this will take longer. So I agree with Mark there. Look, I'm not going to litigate it. I'm sure Mark's, my math is like from 11th grade. We just have a fundamental disagreement about where we think money should be taken into the government. I believe in I just think differently that when you are not taking in taxpayers' money because you are reducing rates, whether it's for corporate or for high earners, that money then cannot be taken in by the government and turned around and utilize it on programs like Medicaid, like Medicare, like Social Security. So we just disagree. I think that's a funnel that should work, and it should work differently. So. But I do think there are two things where I would agree with Mark, which is, of course, these are very big programs in Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. And there are lots of ways they are not working efficiently and well, and we can have legitimate debates about whether we need to restructure how Social Security is administered, who benefits and why. So those are all conversations to be had. I think that what we're exhibiting today is giving you a picture of the difficulty that this is going to encounter in Congress about how they're going to be. I would just say one other thing. First of all, I'm just going to say the biggest beneficiaries of Medicaid right now are just children, poor children. Like, we can talk about whether that's right, wrong, how big it is, but that is the facts. So, but I do think here, what is happening, and I think, Mark, you would agree, we're all just playing some really funny math. And we're like not talking honestly. And that is where I agree. This idea of pay-fors, what we say pay-fors, maybe you're auctioning off spectrum that will happen in like 2050, and that's going to give you $8 billion. Like, it is like fantasy. So I agree that the math pieces are going to be constructed a little bit in reality, a little bit of what's going to make people kind of come to the table because they can only lose, what, like 3 votes? And that's going to be really hard to do. I'm not sure we're going to solve some of the big fundamental problems. And I would actually argue, I think the President Trump missed a political opportunity here. I think there is a lot of resistance to institutions, federal government, and if he had done DOGE, I think in a more sophisticated, less cruel, targeted, strategic way, I think that would be actually, there would be a ton of support for it in a different way, and it could lead to a conversation in a more meaningful way around Social Security and programs that are big and maybe have ways in which they could be more efficient. Maybe that's like overly optimistic, but I see some of those conversations. Yes, you guys are laughing.
No,
I'm
he's
just like
smirking.
a hopeful, I'm like a hopeful gal. But I'm just saying, I see some of that linked because I take, like, look, I've been around long enough. Like, the commissions on like Social Security, like, shoot me in the head. Like, I got them. There's a lot of them. But so what is the pathway to have those real conversations? I do not know, but I think it's interesting that you have like low mistrust of government. Now might be the time, if you were going to build something new and restore trust and get people to think differently about government, maybe that is the time to do it. Maybe in a way that I would hate, but I'm just saying I do think that it's an interesting time to consider that.
That takes me to another question, but I want to have 2 audience questions go to Cy and then come back to that one, which is when that kind of conversation could happen. But so I've a lot of interest here about what happens if President Trump defies Supreme Court orders. So the 2 questions are, if Trump defies the SCOTUS and the courts enlist the U.S. Marshal Office to enforce court orders, could Trump order the U.S. Marshal Office to stand down? Also, on what issues do you expect the Supreme Court will step in and control executive branch overreach, and what do you expect President Trump to do in response? So several audience members are thinking in the same direction here.
I mean, I think in the last question, I think they're going to revive the non-delegation doctrine. The non-delegation doctrine is a view that Congress can't delegate its legislative power to the executive branch or to independent agencies. There's this, it's an idea that's out there, but the court hasn't been enforcing it since the New Deal, and I think the conservative justices want to revive this idea. They think that Congress can't just give a bunch of authority to the executive willy-nilly. And I think once they say that, they'll be striking down some executive action on the grounds that the action was taken pursuant to a statute which unconstitutionally delegates legislative power. And so that, if they do that on a consistent basis, they'll be striking down statutes of Congress that purport to, strengthen the administrative state and purport to give, agencies the authority to make rules that you and I have to follow. And they'll be pushing it back to Congress, and then we'll have to see what Congress does. So I do think that will result in less executive legislation. It won't cure the problem, because I think the executive branch just has the view, I'm going to do a bunch of stuff until someone tells me I can't. But the more often they lose, the less attractive that I think that becomes. I don't think that the president's going to directly defy the Supreme Court, because I believe the president believes he's going to win most of the time, or at least 60% of the time. And why would you want to trash an institution that's going to give its imprimatur to 60% of your policies? So if he thought he was going to lose most of the time, he would be trashing them all the time. We know that. But I don't think he thinks that. I don't think his lawyers think that. And so he has said he's going to follow what the Supreme Court says. Of course, we'll have to wait and see whether that actually comes to pass. But that's my thinking about what he'll do. Now, the problem with my theory is that, if you think you're going to win most of the time, you end up doing crazier things, which means you will lose more often than you thought. But I hope that people are telling him, look, you have chances of winning or losing with this, this new initiative that you're thinking about. You're more likely to lose than win. Maybe you shouldn't do that, and hopefully he'll take that to heart. Because if he just tries to do everything that he wants to do, of course he will end up losing more often, right? Because they're not a rubber stamp for him. I don't believe any of the justices just believe that he can do whatever he wants. They have intellectual commitments that predate this presidency. A lot of them are going to be around after this presidency, and they are not his toadies.
You suggested before, I think, but I'd love to hear more on the use of IEPA and declaring a national economic emergency to apply a tariff. There's a lot of very specific both law and legal and constitutional interpretation around tariffs. So do you think that they will override that? And if they do, will members of Congress say, particularly Republican members say, oh, thank God, I would love to have voted against those tariffs. I don't believe in those tariffs. Please, court, take this responsibility off my shoulders. So first, do you think he'll be overruled? And if he does, will there be Republican members silently cheering?
I think the answer is yes. I think I've looked at the statute. It doesn't use the word tariff. It hasn't been used before to impose a tariff. He has imposed tariffs in the past and not used the statute. There are lots of, in this case, there are lots of Republicans that don't like the use of tariffs. And so he has people who normally would be with him on a bunch of issues intellectually that oppose this move. And so I think it's a perfect storm where both, I think, progressives and conservatives in the judiciary will think this is an overreach. And so I think they will strike it down.
I would agree with all of that. I think that there is no constitutional authority for this, but I would also say that the president's team has undermined the argument too. Like, if you're going to use IEPA for tariffs and you're going to say it's because of fentanyl crisis, they've given so many different messages that'll be used against them in court. I think that hurts them. But hypothetically, the answer to your question is yes, that there'll be members of Congress who don't want to vote against the president because they think it would hurt them in a primary, but are hoping the court solve this. I don't think we'll ever get to that point. I think the reality is that the economic consequence of this will be more dire in the short term. And I think the president will probably know that he would lose ultimately, but he's fine to let it play out until then, and he'll pivot off of this before it ever gets there.
I was just going to say, if the court's consistent, they declared a doctrine called the major question doctrine in Biden's presidency to declare the power plant regulation, which was an attempt to foster alternative energy for the production of power. They declared that unconstitutional, claiming there wasn't clear legislative authority.
Against Obama-Biden era, so going against Democratic presidents' use of
so
those strong powers.
If size right, and I hope he is, they're going to be consistent, then they should. They
Do
should
you
declare
agree?
this.
Do you think that's the grounds on which they'll do it, or will the court get into the question? Because this really becomes interesting in a national security standpoint. That the court says there's no real emergency here, or is it more the statute doesn't list this as a remedy for an emergency?
I mean, I think you could just say, just reading the statute without the major questions doctrine, there's no tariff authority. But you could also say on top of that, and it's a major question, and we're not going to lightly construe a statute of Congress to give him this significant authority to tax the American people. And then on top of that, you could say, if we did read it that way, there'd be a non-delegation problem. Right? They've said multiple things, right? Some people have said it's a major question that we're not going to read into the statute, and other people have said, and even if it were in the statute, it would be a non-delegation. So I could see the more conservative justices saying all three. Without the major question doctrine, he loses. With it, he loses. And then there's also this constitutional issue lurking in the background that makes us deeply reluctant to think that the statute delegates tariff authority to the president in this way. Because again, there are other statutes that do, right? But they come with all kinds of constraints that he doesn't want to follow. In the same way that was true for Truman in the steel seizure case, right? Truman could have used another statute. He didn't want to use that statute because it was temporary and because he hated that statute.
He vetoed it.
The Taft-Hartley Act that he hated, and that's not, the history's not there for in this situation, but he's avoiding using other statutes because they're temporary.
I just wanted to say one other thing. I think that this court particularly is reluctant to intervene in matters of tariffs or immigration policy, but I think their wheelhouse, so to speak, is interpreting the Constitution. And I think the case regarding birthright citizenship and Trump's attempt to reinterpret the 14th Amendment by the stroke of a pen, which they've taken the case recently, that has the potential to be a landmark case, I think. That to me is what I'm waiting for. If the court decides that a president can reinterpret a constitutional amendment by the stroke of a pen, then we can't say we're a republic, and the rule of law means.
So as we're winding down with about 7 minutes left, a really great question for the table. Is the Trump administration doing anything well?
Can you give us a half hour to think?
Mark?
Look, I'd say yes. I think that the president predominantly was elected on the economy and on immigration and the border crisis. And I think that I've shared my concerns about what they're doing economically and how it's a departure from the first administration. But I think that there's no doubt that the border crossings are significantly down. I think he deserves credit for that. I think his energy policy is a strong policy. I think energy prices are lowering in part because GDP is going down, but also because he's providing more supply or an expectation of more supply in the market. I think that confronting the Houthis, I think, has been a departure from the previous administration. I think he deserves credit for that too. I have concerns on the trade front, and I have concerns on the foreign policy front too. Even though I'm pleased to see the aggressive interaction with the Houthis, I think that the abandonment of Ukraine in basically supporting a murderous dictator in Putin, I think is shameful for our party. And so I've been very concerned about that. But I can't sit here and say there's nothing that's good. Sure, I think there's a lot of policies the administration is pursuing that are very positive for the American people.
Please.
I look at it a little bit differently. I look at he's my boss. What is he doing right as my boss? And I think there are things that he does. He's done so beautifully, right? He looks like he's genuinely having fun. He has tons of access to reporters. He will talk at any time and to anyone. I mean, there's some reporting, right, when they were talking about how the Atlantic got the interview, that they just called and he picked up the phone. I mean, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, if he was my boss, you'd be like, what are you doing? But I do think that from a politician in this era of where we are and the total merge of culture and politics, he does that, and he is continuing. He did it in a campaign, and then he's sort of put it on top of a White House, and I would give huge marks for that, and huge marks for his ability to kind of swing and hit with people he disagrees with. And so I look at it from the tactical perspective, that gets very high marks for me. Disagree entirely on every single thing he's done. It's like a downfall of America, but I am for those pieces, high marks.
Can we go to slide 5 here? This is one particularly with Mark and Louisa who managed this process. We alluded to it before, but one of the big things that happens in a president's first year is filling the government with not just appointed people, but confirmed people, nominating and confirmation. So the Senate is moving quickly to confirm President Trump's nominees. The president has the ability to appoint 4,000 people in the U.S. government, 1,000 of whom have to be confirmed. And this has been a challenge in presidents of both parties. And as you can see in Trump 1, that did not go so well. Mark, not blaming you. I think there was a very rough transition the first time that you got brought into halfway. Why are they doing so much better now than they did the first time?
I think it goes back to the earlier point that he has total command and control of the party at this point. And we did not have that in 2017. And I think that he wanted actually through his nominations to help solidify. I think now through his nominations, he's trying to basically troll the Senate to say, I have authority over you. Because I think that the caliber of some of the nominees, I think, would draw in great question. And probably, if these were the same nominees and some of their personal histories put forward by Biden, I think every single Republican would be voting against. So I think there's a tribute in sheer political power and will to the president and his team for having accomplished this as quickly as they have. But I also think there's a cost with that, and that there's really not the same advise and consent role being played by the Senate.
And if there are crises or challenges in coming days, we might see
There will be.
weak officials not acting
There
at
always,
the
there
level
always
of these
are. I
positions.
mean, that's the reality of every mission. There always are. You don't know where it's going to come from, but yes, there will be, and it'll be pressure tested.
Advice and consent isn't just sort of a formal process. It actually has some value.
Well,
you can
again,
weed out the good and the
I
bad.
don't mean to be too gray here, but look, the Senate has abused that too. The Senate is, and we now have thousands of appointees that need to be confirmed by the Senate. They do not have the bandwidth to do that. They tie up nominations and they use that for power in the past to slow things down. And so the Senate has totally abused what that is because they don't know half the people are actually voting on to confirm. There should be a much more narrow number of actual people that need Senate confirmation. But having said that, they should do their job fully. And if somebody does not have the character to be in a position of cabinet, that should be voted on.
We've been working here on a shot clock for Senate confirmations, but we're not going to get into that today. We're going to move relatively soon to the final shot clock here, but Sid and Cy, I just wanted, what has President Trump been doing well that you've seen?
I think one thing I appreciate is the antitrust policy. The antitrust, the Biden administration began a aggressive antitrust policy. And I think monopolization is one of the great threats to American politics now. That kind of monopolization not only sustains a kind of dangerous inequality, but it also, we've always tolerated inequality. But what we've always expected is upward mobility, and the kind of monopolization we see in concentration of economic power, I think, supports. And even though they got rid of Lena Khan, who was kind of at the vanguard of the antitrust policy, they've continued some important actions with respect, for example, to Facebook and Amazon. So I think they've done that well. Can I just add one thing that worries me? Because I wanted to add a caveat to Louise's point about rhetoric. I've studied presidential rhetoric a lot. I think it's really important. It comes with a lot of responsibility. This is visceral with me. I really hate the way President Trump dehumanizes immigrants. This is not to say we shouldn't have a serious debate about immigration. We're seeing a surge in immigration now we haven't seen since the beginning of the 20th century. But I'd like that debate to take place where we balance the kind of economic and cultural contributions immigrants versus the need to control our borders somewhat. And the big target for that was what happened in Springfield. And so I went back and I've been reading the Springfield newspapers. And a lot of those Haitians are going to lose their temporary status very soon. And the Republican mayor and the Republican governor are upset about that because they think they've made a real contribution to Springfield. So I feel, my grandfather emigrated here from Ukraine in 1910 when Jewish people from Eastern Europe were dehumanized. And we got really a draconian nativist law passed in 1924. So I would just like to see us debate immigration without rhetoric that dehumanizes the
I
people
was
who come to
certainly
this
not
country. Oh, I know,
supporting
I know.
like
No, I was just
dehumanizing rhetoric.
no, I wasn't
For
saying you were
my
defending.
A+, yes.
Yeah.
Cy, what have they been doing well?
I mean, I'm an immigrant, so I don't like dehumanizing immigrants either. But I do think that it matters, whether what sort of message the executive is sending to people in terms of, compliance with the law. And I think, there's been no change in the law, but there's been a dramatic reduction in border crossings. And I think that was partly due to a dereliction of duty on the part of the Biden administration, just a sense that it's not a priority and we're just not going to focus on it. So I do think that matters because I think even though you shouldn't dehumanize immigrants, the country doesn't want an open border. And so I think that is an accomplishment. But I agree that we should humanize people generally.
Okay, we are now nearly at time, and so with the help of our team, we're going to go to the Miller Center shot clock, which for those who have been here before, because of our friends down Massey Road at JPJ, the shot clock is essential to UVA basketball, and it's becoming essential to the Miller Center. So the way this works is I'm going to give each of our panelists, and I'm going to take a final stab And you actually get an option. You can play short-term or long-term. So the question to the table is, what are you looking for in the next 100 days to 1 year? What is the thing that you're most focused on? Or more broadly, these big changes in presidential power are so unnerving for many, many Americans. If you could do one thing to change the presidency, what would it be? And so why don't we go in the reverse order that we started? I think we went this way. So Cy, 30 seconds. Either change the presidency with one wave of your magic wand, or what are you looking at in the next 100 days?
I mean, I'm tempted to pass the ball to one of the other folks at the table.
Start the
because
clock.
they're better shots. I think that the Congress has to pass legislation. The best time to pass legislation reforming the president is when the president's leaving office, and when we don't know who the new president's going to be. And I think that's a golden hour for people to think about what the presidency ought to be, or how to think about reforming it when there's a veil of ignorance, when no one knows who the next president's going to be, and people can legislate without thinking about how it affects their particular party, but think about the system writ large. And I think that's possible to do. And the current president doesn't have to feel threatened, because of course you could just make it apply in the next presidency. So I think that's what they should be doing. They should get the best and the brightest, Sid and these folks, to think about what to do. But that's like 3 years from now.
Louisa,
I'm going to go short term.
please.
I'm hopeful that Mark's prediction all come true. What I'm looking at is, I like to see what consumer prices are in Labor Day. I want to know what kids are paying to go back to school and what that looks like. I think that's going to be important. And I'm going to add a second wish, which is, I say this with genuine curiosity and goodwill, is I want to know what's on the agenda after the tax bill. What do they want to get done? And legislatively, more in a domestic sphere. I share a lot of Mark's concerns around the foreign policy piece, but I'm ready to be surprised.
Long-term optimistic. There's nothing I would necessarily change the executive branch. I think it's there. Even though I went to graduate school here, I went to undergraduate over the hills at Washington University, and my former professor is here, and he used to teach us of the wisdom of our framers. Bill Conley back there. He used to teach us of the wisdom of our framers, and I think they have created the most endurable and amazing structure of government we could ever imagine, and that this pendulum will swing back when the legislative and judicial branch assert themselves. And I think short term, I'm more pessimistic, because I do think that there's going to be more economic pain with this trade agenda. There are ships being turned back to Asia right now and not filling ports in California and Canada, and I think that there's going to be more dire consequences, which I think is going to have a bigger impact on the legislation this summer, which is why I think it's going to stall and drag until the end of the year before they can get something done.
Oh, wow. Hey.
God, I'm glad I got to go last year. Being an academic, I'm going to look at the long term, and I want to say something about civic culture. I think we have to do something about our civil culture. And from my vantage point, we have to do something about the country's enthrallment with presidential power. For all the differences between the red and blue tribes, they both love presidential power and want it to be used for the causes they believe in. But given the factionalism in the country, we're in a situation where both Republicans and Democrats love the presidency, but half the country hates the president. And that's a very bad conundrum to be within. So I'm out, right?
Yeah.
The buzzer went off. I noticed the buzzer didn't go off.
We had no buzzer.
Yeah.
I will take moderator's prerogative and use my own 30 seconds, and I'm going to tie a couple of these together. What I'm really looking at is the president's popularity around Labor Day, how it affects the Virginia gubernatorial race, which will be the first election along with New Jersey, my home state, my two home states. Typically, New Jersey and Virginia vote against the incumbent president. And if that happens, that will set the stage for the last 2 years of the Trump presidency, because you would have possibly Democrats controlling at least one house, most likely only the House. Would they work with President Trump, or does he double down on executive action when he has a Democratic Congress? So that's what I'm watching. To all of you, thank you so much, not just for being with us today, for all semester long. We still have a few more events. Next week we have an event, and then I think we have one the following week. Next week we'll be looking back at the presidential studies Presidential Recordings Program, which we've had here at the Miller Center for at least 3 decades. And then our final event of the semester is looking back at First Ladies in America, which is not written at all into the Constitution and has been incredibly consequential in the big moments in American history. But this is the last event I'll be at, so I want to just thank you all for a really, really great year and look forward to seeing you in the fall.